Alright, so my um, goal for this short lecture is to go over the aim of my course for philosophical readings, my electives for philosophy 495. So I've sharpened what my interests are, I would say, overall, by these selected readings. And while my intent was to find answers, it's certainly in compatibility with Wittgenstein's meta-philosophy that all I can do is elucidation or sharpen my questions, but I nevertheless search for answers. And so, that being said, elucidations can be a kind of answer, if Wittgenstein is right, and I think I've found some answers. I've realized that what troubles me is related to religious epistemology, when we have two seemingly contradictory propositions where, for instance, a Muslim would say, Allah has revealed to me that Jesus of Nazareth was ascended and not crucified because Allah would not suffer his righteous prophets to die. And of course, the testimony of the apostles and of Christianity that Jesus Christ was crucified and died and was resurrected on the third day. So we have two propositions, they're religious, and they must be amenable to logic, at least logically, that is, they, they have contradictories, in that both Islam and Christianity cannot be true. So if one says, I just know or I feel that God has revealed to me that this is true, and someone else says the same thing about their religion and they contradict each other, I think we can still say that one of them is wrong. And I just have a problem then of how religious truths are possible at all. It still seems like I'm leaving something in indeterminacy, but I'm not, because I want. It shows us that thought has nowhere left to go when all that these people could say to each other. If someone says, "Oh, I know that this is true. God has revealed this to me," then I ask them, "Well, what do you say about someone who says the same thing that has revealed that what you're saying is not true?" The only thing that they could say is, "My God isn't your God," and then that seems to suggest that this kind of ultimate religious truth isn't possible. And I'm really taken aback by that. And I'll get to the answers that I've found in my readings, but just I'm going to read the goals and kind of add what I've found so far as I've gone through these readings. And excuse me, I am sick, so my voice might be here and there exacerbated. So the goal of this course is to elucidate Hegel's philosophy, specifically his logic and dialectic, from an analytic perspective. How Hegel's philosophy, specifically his logic and mysticism, squares with Wittgenstein's. And in addition to that, to elucidate the problem of something and nothing, and contemplate the roles these philosophies play in the varying conceptions of faith. I don't know how much the problem of something and nothing has come up actually in any of these readings, but it still is related, and I have had some light shed on that. And certainly Hegel's limits, mysticism, and logic in Wittgenstein's has definitely been brought to light in these readings, specifically Hegel's conception of unknowable. So that we will get to. So the problem of flux, something and nothing, is the beginning of philosophy. I say Parmenides and Heraclitus are traditionally diametrically opposed to each other, though sometimes they are not. Both Hegel and Wittgenstein shed light on this problem, whether or not nothing exists, and how these words something and nothing are, if at all, opposites. So Hegel definitely tackles this in his dialectic, but not really in the way that I hoped. So I've learned to get clear about my own misgivings as a philosopher, and then go from there. Nevertheless, when we do read theories in philosophy, or we just read any robust philosophical system, we develop along the hermeneutical circle. So I've learned that I am put in a position to give greater descriptions and ask more exact questions than I was before. And that's always a wonderful thing. That is what education, qua education, is. All of logic and division rests on this basic distinction and affect the varying uses of the word faith. I'm not actually being very clear here at all. I'm trying to get at something that's really problematic, and my way of doing that wasn't very clear here. So I would want to be clearer than I was when I wrote the strategy of the course, now having read what I have. So I'm going to go through now my notes on all of this, and I'm not going to probably be able to. So the first one is thinking without presuppositions and freedom and truth. So I'm not going to be able to probably read everything in here because that would take a long time. So this is Houlgate's book, Freedom, Truth, and History, an Introduction to Hegel's Philosophy, Chapter 2, Thinking Without Presuppositions from Indeterminate to Determinate Thought. Hegel's claim is that his system is presuppositionless. So he's not arbitrarily laying anything down, that it's just thought thinking itself. That's quite a claim. And so we're interested, especially as philosophers, if such a project is even possible. But what comes up first in the dialectic is being and nothing, which turn out to be the same. So it's as if the circle implodes and then becomes a bigger circle. That's the character analogy. That's the analogy we're using that's helpful to understand Hegel's dialectic. And this is analytic. This isn't a mere artistic claim or something, or it's not poetry or something. This is analytic. Because I'll show in this, I kind of mark that here. The tilde that we use in formal logic is that it is not the case. But we know from Parmenides, if we are to say that anything is not, that those state of affairs are not reflected in the world, when we say that it is not, we have to instantiate it. We have to say it is not. We have to instantiate that thing. Even employing the negation sign in formal logic is an instantiation of that thing that doesn't exist. In order to say that it doesn't exist, we have to have the thought that it already does exist. That's clear. That's analytic. So if we accept that being charitable to Hegel, we can already see then that contradiction itself is inherently unstable. And if it is, then he has room, an analytic claim, to go forward and to say that something and nothing are the same thing, and that is just becoming in abstraction. Because we're starting again here from abstraction in Hegel's dialectic. We're not saying nothing and something of something. We're not doing negation of anything. We're talking about just thought itself. And thought always thinks in these terms of something and nothing. So so that's really a summary here. So the conclusion then is the laws of logic of non-contradiction and identity are self-contradictory, and that's totally legitimate from my notes here and from understanding Hegel's system. So that's what. Okay. Houlgate wants, it's important to make the distinction that the concept of being is not equivalent to the concept of becoming, but that when it is thought through, it turns into the concept of becoming. So Hegel's dialectic is that in order for thought to proceed, it's a sublation where it turns into its opposite and then becomes something. So it's as if we start with a circle with our thoughts of something and nothing, and then once we realize that they're identical, the circle implodes from the inside and then immediately gets larger, and that then the sphere of understanding in the self is greater than it was. This is totally analytical. And once that happens, it's not that something and nothing were identical, it's just that they were inherently unstable, and so sublation needed to happen. so that reason could encapsulate them both. So the dialectical principle for Hegel is whereby apparently stable thoughts reveal their inherent instability by turning into their opposites and then into new, more complex thoughts. My analogy of the circle implosion. It is the soul of all truly scientific knowledge has become science is not supposed to take anything for granted. Okay, so by the way, this idea of sublation and that there's inherent instability, that things turn into their opposites and then go above, is actually very clear in ethics, very clear. So here it goes. Hegel says, in political life, as everyone knows, extreme anarchy and extreme despotism naturally lead to one another. The perception of dialectic in the province of individual ethics is seen in the well-known adage, pride comes before a fall. Too much wit outwits itself. Even feeling, bodily as well as mental, has its dialectic. Everyone knows how the extremes of pain and pleasure pass into each other. The heart overwhelming with joy seeks relief in tears, and the deepest melancholy will at times betray its presence by a smile. That is clear. When we turn to our beloved and we see them in tears, we say, "What's wrong?" They say, "Nothing. I'm happy." What has always been sadness associated, signaling sadness in human behavior, namely tears in human physiology, tear ducts excretion, is now turning into its opposite, joy. And that does happen. So this idea, taken up more clearly in ethics, is not far-fetched. Or again, pride comes before a fall, right? And pride is, everything I'm doing is right, I can be proud that I'm on the right, but then that comes before a fall, before humility. Opposition is the same thing, is the idea that we start with at Hegel. I go on as a Latter-day Saint to try and square this with our doctrine. Jacob 5 talks about here, God says in likening Israel and his people, and anybody who can be grafted in or accepts the gospel of Jesus Christ, as an olive garden and an olive tree. And in this, he says, "You shall take away the bad as the good shall grow." The bad and the good are inherently related, and the good only becomes the good through the operation, through the sustainment of the bad. That's how the good grows and becomes stronger. That idea as well. Truman Matson is aware of this Hegelian truth. He says, in talking about the fallibility and suffering of life, and the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, and that imaginary dialogue with the mother of a stillborn child. He says, mother asks, "Is it all so hard, this life, that there's just so much suffering, there's nothing we can do?" "Yes, yet strangely beautiful, strangely beautiful, strangely beautiful." Again, Matson is even aware of this Hegelian truth, that things turn into their opposites. Why is it strangely beautiful? Because this pain is pleasure. This pain is a beauty, and that's strangely beautiful. Things turning into their opposites. Very clear. I think I've demonstrated that. We can totally be charitable to Hegel's dialectic of opposites turning into themselves and going beyond. I liked to say this, drawing from DNC 93 as a Latter-day Saint. Excuse me. We must regain our innocence that we lose as children through the darkness of the world. So we lose our innocence, and we have to regain it, our innocence, and become innocent again. It's like Hegel's dialectic. We have to go through thought thinking itself, and the opposites turning into their other, and seeing. It's as if when we leave the Garden of Eden, the good and bad categories at the end of a just life, the good and the bad, we recognize them as one, and we see then what the right choice is, where the good and the bad were the same, through the dialectic of life. And then we come to the end of life, and we see we regain our innocence, so that then anybody that would come into conflict or confrontation with us would have a mirror to recognize that they need to discipline themselves. Just like when we try to discipline a child before the age of toddler, there's no disciplining possible. All there is, right, it's us. So I wanted to take this up too. Wittgenstein was told, if you would let yourself sin, so let's just use this though, generally. If you would let yourself sin once in a while, you might give yourself a chance at salvation. Things turn in their opposite. What? How can I sin if I'm trying to be perfect? You need to sin. We know that's a Christian truth because none of us can be perfect because none of us is the Savior. So paradoxically, if we actually think that we can be perfect, or that it's in attainment and that we already are perfect, then we actually are not giving ourselves a chance at salvation or the need for a Savior. So we need to feel that we're sinners, and we need to allow ourselves to sin in that sense, in some sense that's at least clear. So the perfectionist must become imperfectionist. It turns into its opposite in order to move beyond it. This does not, of course, suggest sinning, but that judgment be withheld. Perfectionism is a sin, and its opposite, imperfectionism, righteous as salvation, where salvation is becoming a new creature. Hegel's dialectic of becoming. You must first accept that you are sinful before you can become sinless. All right. First reading. Okay. Part 9, Chapter 27, from Hegel and Pragmatism, a companion to Hegel, Blackwell Companions to Philosophy by Robert Stern. This is a selection from out of there. Part 9, let's see. Okay, so Stern. All right, what Stern is taking up here, it's important for Hegel because Hegel is usually criticized in specific ways or supported in specific ways. So Stern is really going to augment those critical and supportive perceptions of Hegel's system. And so that is one of pragmatism. That's one of them. And so he's going to get at that. By the way, so I needed to get clear about what pragmatism is in philosophy, and it's the praxis or practicality between theory and application. So in philosophical theory, I think you could say this, it's like what is indeterminate and determinate, right? It's like what is clear in what we're saying and what is not. Like what point does something become poetic, and at what point does it become or aesthetic, and at what point does it become analytical or somewhat amenable or clear to the understanding in a dialectical way. Hegel certainly seems to be on the fringe of both of those things, which is probably why the analytic and continental traditions became a distinction after Hegel, because there was this point where you had this great philosophical, historical thinker who claimed to be the end of philosophy and made all these claims in which we had to make, philosophers were so uncomfortable or that couldn't understand him that they had to make that kind of pseudo distinction. And I am I agree with Conan that there isn't a distinction between analytic and continental, and so there's no philosophical illumination that can be made from that distinction, so it's not even a real distinction. That's great. I really like that. Because then we're just arguing about like politics in philosophy, which is totally inappropriate. So for Hulgate, after Kant, the Cartesian project, but Stern is reacting to Hulgate's, the prior reading I just had. That's why these are next to each other in chronological order. So he's reacting to Houlgate's reading of Hegel, and he's going to talk about pragmatism. So he says, Houlgate, after Kant, the Cartesian product seems to be more than just a rather narrow attempt to provide solid foundations for the sciences. It now becomes part of a much more ambitious agenda, which is to liberate human consciousness by developing Descartes' idea that philosophy may take nothing for granted in search for truth, and that thought is the principle of doubt or criticism that frees us from the authority of habitual but unwarranted belief. So Stern is really going to be Hegel Stern is going to be critical to an aspect of Houlgate's reading of Hegel, and that's that we need to doubt everything. Stern is going to explore, do we really need to, or can we even doubt everything in order to get a system of philosophy going? And in what way is Hegel honestly doing that? That's what he is asking and exploring in this essay. This is why Hegel's logic starts out by not taking the law of non-contradiction and identity for granted either, Houlgate might say. His aim is for thought and consciousness to show itself what itself is. This happens through his dialectic, which is the process of categories converting themselves into other categories, and not the arbitrary self, but thought itself, as we've discussed. Seeing this from this perspective, Houlgate argues Hegel may be viewed as attempting to complete this Kantian project of radical self-criticism that Kant himself was unable to achieve insofar as he took too much for granted concerning the nature of thought and its categories, with the result that he failed to provide a proper deduction of them, as Fichte and others have also argued. This failed because Kant thought we had to survey the capacities or structure of reason itself before using it. However, Hegel argues that is like trying to learn how to swim with never having gotten in the water. It's just a brilliant, clear, analytical, just criticism of Kant's project in one sentence, the best that I know. That is, you can't survey or criticize something when you don't know anything about it or what it hangs together with. It's like you're already using reason even when you're surveying reason. So it is in epistemology, by the way, where pragmatism lies. Charles Peirce challenges this epistemic Cartesian starting point of philosophy. And this is shared, I think, by Wittgenstein's private language argument, in that we cannot doubt the use of our words, or in other words, if you cannot be sure of the meaning of your words, you cannot be sure of any fact either, as Wittgenstein says. Okay. So Peirce says, let us not try and pretend to doubt what we, in our heads or in the intellect, what we do not doubt in our hearts. And that's, I think, an important idea for trying to understand maybe Hegel. Because Hegel, I think, an analytic philosopher, a traditional analytic philosopher, might be really hesitant to engage Hegel because he would say, this is just poetry. Why is he saying that? Because it could be for all sorts of reasons. But one is, you could easily read Hegel that way. But you can also read him analytically and seriously, which is how I read him, and I totally think it's possible. And if that's the case, then he's not saying, giving a character philosophy or something like that, of his hopes of what it is, but he's actually giving a kind of proof through a geometry of why thought is unstable at this weight, and then why it has to go beyond itself. Okay. I want to basically summarize Stern here in my own words briefly, then going through the rest of these slides. So, Peirce, that's his contribution in pragmatism. Let us not doubt in our hearts what we do. Let us not to pretend to doubt in our minds what we do not doubt in our hearts. Okay. Peirce's contribution in being more critical of Cartesian starting point, where we have to doubt everything and then return to what we know is already true. And there's a truth in that, right? There's no good. We're just being cynical. And I think Peirce, just like Hegel, is showing where both logic and ethics are one. In that this normative claim that let us not doubt what is in our hearts, that kind of idea of which Peirce is critical of is what led Kant, inheriting Descartes, to say let's analyze reason. He then applied that to the human capacity of reason before we proceed with reason. And that's like trying to learn how to swim without getting in the water. It's just not possible. You have to engaging reason. Not engaging reason is not an option, because it's not abstracted from thought. So there is a point at which these things overlap. What could be interesting or as a potential topic is what ways is Stern right and Stern wrong, and which way is Houlgate right and which Houlgate is wrong. I've considered this for a sample paper for graduate school. And I don't know if that's what I'm going to do, but I think there's room there. It would be to show, okay, which ways are they right? You know, because they're both living great scholarly Hegelian philosophers, Hegelian scholars. So that's something that you could do, because I don't think either of them have it quite right. And so I could contribute to that. And I'm sorry I'm not being explicit about that, but for time's sake and trying to actually put something like this together. Okay, next. Criticism of the conception of the unknowable. This is great. W.T. Stace is maybe like one of I think every philosopher should read his book. That this thing, W.T. Stace's book on Hegel, and it's like out of print, but I think it was published in the 1920s, cannot be ignored. You could use this book to teach an introduction to philosophy. That's how good it is. This is utterly analytical, and it's very, very clear. And it helps get into the role of nothing and something in a way that I'm talking about. And also of limits, which I'm really interested in. And in just saying that there are things that cannot be said, the said-shown distinction of Wittgenstein, right? That temptation. That there are things that we cannot say that can only be shown. And first of all, Wittgenstein and Parmenides and Hegel say anything that is an object of consciousness can be said. It can be described. And so for Wittgenstein too, what can be thought can be said. And so to say that something can only be, and to grasp it can only be shown but not said, you can talk about it. And that's Conant's reading of the Tractatus, and that has to be right. And that has to be something as clever, rigorous of a thinker as Wittgenstein was available. And all of that argument is in Conant's The Method of the Tractatus and other later scholarly works, readings of Wittgenstein's Tractatus and his works as a philosopher. We'll get to that later more in detail, but let's talk about the concept of the unknowable. It'll give rise to contradictions, not just Kant's, but any theory of an unknowable. So philosophy, philosophical thought, is the formal possibility of godhood, which is a concept amenable to the understanding. So I want to square everything I do with Mormonism and at BYU, and so I'm trying to do that. By formal possibility of godhood, I mean that as far as Mormon doctrine is concerned, to make the claim that we cannot know everything now can only mean that there are some things to which we are now ignorant of and will remain ignorant of, but not that something is unknowable. Hegel's system may succeed in describing the formal structure of becoming omniscient. I think it could actually succeed at doing that, but not the character. That's something we have to become, which is a character process through the living of a life and choosing to respond to certain propositions, the will, which is to describe the change of heart. Therefore, to suggest that man has limits in thought is to suggest that the station of God is untenable, undeniable, becoming joint with Christ. I just want to make this argument in Mormonism that Hegel's making on his criticism of the unknowable. What I mean is to say that there are objects of consciousness behind the understanding of consciousness is an impossibility. In other words, the claim that there are just some things we cannot understand as children of God is untenable in this sense. The theory of the unknowable is self-contradictory because it assumes that existence is possible independently of mind and consciousness. To say that there is some object of consciousness unknowable, or that there is some understanding God has that is unknowable, is to assert a limit, namely that there are limits to what is a possible object of human thought. However, to assert that an object of knowledge is unknowable is to assert that it is knowable. That's clear. This is tied to his dialectic. This is because knowledge is a concept, and concepts are epistemic objects, and epistemic objects must exist. Therefore, to be able to say that something is unknowable is to have access to the unknowable, to have access to things you're claiming is unknowable. Example, the ultimate reason why he died is unknowable is a contradiction because you're stating that it is no unknowable, right? The tilde in negative instantiations, the tilde employed in formal logic as a logical symbol in logical notation is an instantiation. I'm making the claim that this thing does not exist, but in order to do that, I have to say it does exist. Therefore, nothing is unknowable. Compare and contrast Wittgenstein's claim that logical space is unbounded. The existential quantifier, there's nothing that cannot be captured by it in formal logic. Contingent facts are unknown, but not unknowable. So there may be a gold nugget at the bottom of an ocean on a planet in the distant cosmos that we cannot survey, but this is still a logically possible fact, right? It's a contingent fact that we just don't know because we haven't verified it. But that's really trivial, and that's not what we're trying to get at philosophy. So of course there might be contingent facts that we don't know, but who cares about that? Laying claim to something that this is unknowable, this is or is not that thing unknowable, is to say that it is at least in degree knowable is clear. The word existence has no meaning except the possibility of being known, the possibility of being an object to consciousness. To say that anything exists means that it is a possible object for consciousness. The theory of being unknowable is self-contradictory. Boom. So total ignorance of a thing involves total unawareness of it. We couldn't even say then that it was unknowable. It just would be. Again, compare and contrast Wittgenstein. If anything is hidden from us, it is of no interest to us. Too easy, right? To be aware of our ignorance of a thing is only possible if we know something of the thing and realize that this knowledge is very slight. But complete ignorance of the thing would be complete unconsciousness of it and would involve that we could not even be aware of our ignorance of it. Now the theory of the unknowable ignores these considerations. It implies, in the first place, that there is an absolute limit to our knowledge and that we know the limit and know nothing of what lies beyond the limit. An impossibility, that's clear. And that's why Conant's interpretation of the Tractatus is more holistic, given the preface in 654 and everything in between. And it implies, in the second place, an absolute ignorance of something combined with an awareness of this ignorance, also an impossibility. For we can only know the limit by being aware of what is beyond the limit, and that would mean that knowledge has already passed beyond its supposed limit, or in other words, that the limit is no limit. If anything, therefore, is unknowable, this means that it is absolutely unknowable. The use of the word absolutely. I'm really interested now in the sense of the absolute. While I understand this, I think it means that it's contradictory, that it's opposite, that it, I'm not sure. I would be in conjecture now, so I don't want to say, but I'm really interested in that word of, we hear this like absolute value, absolute value judgments, like, Wittgenstein, so they don't have a sense, right? They're like senseless. And so to say absolutely unknowable is senseless, in the sense that it's not presenting us any information if we say something. So yeah, it could be squared. I just worked through it. This could be squared with Wittgenstein's senselessness, tautologies and contradictions, specifically tautologies, that they don't present, that they don't make any assertions. So if you say something is unknowable, or that there is an unknowable, you could say, but that's just a tautology, because if it is unknowable, we're not aware of it. So it's absolutely unknowable, just like absolute value judgments in the lecture on ethics. There's nothing behind the metaphors. We can't drop them and survey them as bipolar, senseful propositions, being capable of being true or false. Were it not for this accidental circumstance, the fact itself would be quite as easily knowable. Apart from all accidental circumstances, this is just talking about contingent facts. Yeah. All right, we got that out of the way. Okay, so this is chapter 3. So I've got, those two sections. I said varying sections. I've got them here. We'll start with this. This is from Stace's book. So I've got various sections in here. Reason as self-determined, like presuppositionless thought, in other words, is taken up here. And I love this because we get close to the phenomenology of spirit, qua phenomenology of spirit. What is reason? Qua reason. That etymology of that word I looked up, it's raison in French, and it first meant something like logos. It's like word, or justification and fairness. So it wasn't like merely mathematical or something like that. The first principle cannot be a cause, but must be a reason, because we do not see a logically necessary connection between reason and consequent. Causes do not explain the world, because it is impossible to see any necessary connection between a cause and its effect. Self-determined reason is reason that by necessity explains the universe. That's what we have to start with in Hegel's logic. That has to be right. If you want a self-explanatory absolute system of philosophy, this is what you need. These are the ingredients. Reason must be able to explain itself. If it is unexplained, then it is a mystery. If it is explained by something other than itself, then it is not the first principle. We need a first principle. Because this other something would be prior to the first principle, and therefore not a first principle. This is how good of a philosopher, by the way, Hegel is, because he's taking into consideration all the great philosophers, namely Spinoza's first principle. He was right in seeing that he could use a first principle, and he used being as being able to explain the universe, the cosmos, everything. So a first cause would be an existent thing of which we could insistently demand a higher cause. But reason is a self-explanatory principle. That is, physical causes have no necessary cause, but reason does. Therefore, because reason is its own cause, and reason is its own explanation, it's reason, right? That's clear. Therefore, cause and effect, physical causes, will always demand a higher reason or cause than the first cause. Compare and contrast the Big Bang and the Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam cosmological argument only works because, which is embedded in space-time in the Big Bang, right? Because before that, then there had to be a meta-cause, right? A transcendent cause. But the only reason it works is because God is eternal, right? So he is a self-cause. There's, it's like he's reason, he's eternal. So it's like the same thing. Spinoza is the first to realize that the first principle must be self-explained, and does so through substance, that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, that the conception of which does not depend on the conception of another thing from which it must be formed. The first principle cannot be a cause of any sort. Here, in contrast, Wittgenstein logic treats of all possibilities, and all possibilities are its facts. The subsequent state of affairs cannot be said to fit. If the thing can exist with an atomic fact, that the thing must be prejudged in the thing. There are no accidents in logic. It's the same kind of thing that he's trying to describe. What Spinoza means is that substance is self-determinate, self-explained, except by reference to that other thing. A necessary reason must explain itself. Spinoza succeeded in doing that. To ask what reason itself should be proved rational is to make a demand which has no meaning. Reason is its own reason, right? It's like, because will is curiously bound up with reason, which I'm really interested in now. It is by its very conception self-explanatory and self-determined. Reason is self-determined and self-explanatory. Reason doesn't look to anything else. That word, right? Oh, where is reason gonna look for an explanation? Reason is its own explanation. And if reason doesn't have an own explanation, reason will find its explanation. Therefore, reason is its explanation. So I put that has to be right. Reason is inherently self-explanatory, necessary, sufficient. I think reason might be bound up with the metaphysical I, or the will, which makes it both logical and psychological, as the will as spirit. Therefore, not only is Hegelian claim that the dialectic is the evolution of thought thinking itself presuppositionlessly, but also chosen by the will if the willer wills. The distinction between reason and a reason is similar to that between causation and a cause. Now then comes all the questions, well, what about a reason, right? So it's like, what about a premise and an argument? So this means that once we move from universals to particulars, from pure category to an instance of that category, there must be some kind of event in which then thought has to reflect on itself and try and make sense of a system. But reason isn't that. So moving from the pure category to the indefinite article is to move, so A in English, is to move from necessarily self-sufficient to contingent. So reason, raison, pure category, doesn't need any explanation or anything. But a reason, el raison, I don't know what it would be in French if that's helpful, but ein Grund, oder in Rede, in Dutch, then it's contingent and we need to explain it. But reason isn't really important because ultimately the end of Hegel's dialectic will be reason or spirit. That's the end. But then to ask the question what goes past that is just to start the system all over again. Okay, so it's absolute. Historical progress of philosophy, according to Hegel, it's really important and just so insightful and brilliant of Hegel that he incorporates the history of philosophy as his philosophy. And you can really learn a lot about the history of philosophy and philosophy generally through just studying Hegel. So, talking about a reason and reason, the principles that reason is the explanation of things obviously involve the separation of things from the reason. So if reason is to explain things, we must not have in the reason any of the things which are to be explained. So that's because if it's going to be absolute, that's the character that your reason, that your system, that your philosophy has to have. That's clear. Otherwise, we're always going to ask. So Hegel is trying to give us, let's be charitable, Hegel is actually trying to give us that kind of thing. And I don't know yet anybody who succeeded at, well, at least attempting to try to do this kind of thing. That's crazy. We need to really consider and take that into consideration. We must therefore have reason as it is in itself pure reason. We must get wholly rid of the sensuous element, for the sensuous element is just the element of things, the things which we have to explain. Sensuous, you could say imagistic, images in the mind, feelings, anything really bound up with empirical, where thought no longer, or categories, whatever, where thought no longer is at home. It's no longer at home once it's asking questions. And obviously, it's through philosophy we ask questions. We ask questions because we're trying to get answers to questions. And Wittgenstein, anything that can be asked can be answered. And everything can be asked, according to Conan, so everything can be answered. A way to summarize this is thought has to take and separate them into categories and parts in order for thought to come back and to make them a whole again. Thought has to have a kind of Muriel logic where it breaks things down into little parts and sews them back together again to the whole in order to make itself at home again. This is like losing your innocence and trying to regain it again, right? That's usually an ethical analogy, but it can be applied logically as well, as I just did. He says that formal logic succeeded at doing this, and at his time it was still nevertheless mainly Aristotelian logic, so he has this syllogism here, and he says it's really reducible to something like this: all M is P, some M is S, therefore some S is P. And so this is what thought has to do. This is what he's talking about, where it's not absolute. Thought isn't at home, so it has to break things into parts. And it does so. It separates objects into merely thoughts, and it does that in a logical notation. And if it succeeds at doing that, and I think most logicians would agree, then we can actually get rid of empirical objects altogether. But he'll go on to explain this doesn't mean that. We do need to be in the world to get knowledge of certain objects in the world. Nevertheless, that we can have experience of those objects, and this is where Kant will come into play in his response, that we can have conditions and learn of those experiences is the logical conditions of those experiences. It's also important to name that Hegel's dialectic and just logic in general is atemporal, because then that would be an argument against presuppositionlessness, because in order to be presuppositionless, it would also have to be outside of time, because if the will has to just think something, right, and we see that as always being a choice and not thought thinking itself, then we will never be able to accept Hegel's claim. But it's clear that, while I might go unconscious after I read a premise, and there's a conclusion in the logical argument, once I'm conscious and read the second premise and the conclusion, it's not that in time the premises are flowing to conclusions. They're not doing that. We don't need time for any of that, right? Because once it's read, we know that in order for that thing to be possible at all, those premises flowing to that conclusion, it has to be eternally crystalline, logical, which has to be atemporal for it to even make sense, or to conclude in the first place. So logic in Hegel's dialectic is atemporal. Yeah, you can't doubt the use of your words is a consequence of Wittgenstein's private language argument. That's obviously where Kant is wrong and where Hegel succeeds in too, and shares that with Wittgenstein. So Kant said that the categories are prior to experience. But experience is the world. Experience Kant used because he looked at everything from a subjective and epistemological point of view. But what is subjectively our experience is objectively considered the world. Experience, therefore, is coterminous with the universe. It's kind of a blow to Kant's project. Any conceivable world must itself be one world. So I think this is important because when we imagine possible worlds, it's actually irrelevant, because any possible world is the capital T ontological first world. Then in here is the problems of Kant's categories. And I'm using Wittgenstein again through all of this. I conclude to think sensuously is philosophically sophomoric at best. So Pictorial thinking is egregious philosophically. Again, because reason is the formal conditions of everything, even what is thought to be merely in itself or for itself. I think that's the noumena in Kant that makes these things thinkable. Everything is a possible logical fact entity within the bounds of reason. And just to be clear, whether or not some experience is true for one will and not for another, as psychology claims, is irrelevant, because what is known or experienced by one and not another is still the formal conditions of the thing, category thought. So the antithetically Kantian claim is that categories are objective realities, prior to all subjective minds into the world. And Hegel, through this, I'm just giving you the summary, proves this for the sake of time. Okay, let's move on. The next division, I got through a couple of them. I don't think I separated another slide. Maybe I did, or maybe this is it. Alright, and then this section, which is next, because I said I have various sections, I've gone over those. Next we're going to get to chapter 3 in the third division of Stace's book, and that's titled Philosophy. So, the absolute religion has for its content the absolute truth, but its defects is that it presents this truth in the form of contingency. For example, the creation of the world is represented by its chance event, which happened. To show that anything is necessary means to show that it is logical and rational. When this Vorstellung is stripped off and nothing but the pure thought is left, we have philosophy, which gives the absolute content in the absolute form. Now, certainly this is abstract, but nevertheless, I would argue that it is analytical, insofar as it can be analyzed, the concepts, and that these conclusions that we reach through analysis is justified. We've already shown this with how formal logic strips away the things, and it just becomes the forms. And we've also dealt with the question, well then, what about the things I need knowledge of by going out into the world? We've also dealt with that. Now we're moving forward. I thought these would be interesting sections that might give me answers to my questions, so that's why I searched them. Completed philosophy sees the absolute as idea. So the idea is thus both subject and object here. So he just talks about how, like, Parmenides, right, the pre-Socratics or Eleatics, talked about, becoming Heraclitus, being was Parmenides, he lays being to someone else, I think, Hegel. Hegel means his own philosophy in which the truth of all previous philosophers is gathered up and absorbed, just as the truth of all lower religions is comprised in Christianity. Any allegorical narrative fails to explain the cause of the universe because causes are not absolute. Again, talking about like Genesis, it just starts randomly that God created the world, right? And so it's not absolute because it's a chance event. And chance is like causes a chance, right? It's not absolute. It's not self-explanatory. Philosophy, according to Hegel, is the realm logical, rational, absolute, abstract. This moves in the dialectic is paramount because this is where absolute content arrives in absolute form. Where we have absolute form and absolute content, we have absolute truth. Hence, completed philosophy sees the absolute as idea. So I just said this is such a beautiful summary. Once we strip away the auxiliary centrist features of thought, we are left as subject as object because we get at pure thought. So where you see the subject-object division for Hegel is dissolved through just abstracting and shaving off the sensuous, imagistic features of these thoughts and just having the pure logical elements of the thoughts. And then we can get the object-subject distinction dissolves. Subject and object are now identical. Absolute reconciliation is reached. Absolute spirit is the same thing which has now given itself actuality, has passed from the sphere of pure thought of categories into actual existence. The rational is the actual is the rational. The actual is reason, reason is actual, we could say. That is like just a summary of Hegel's system. Philosophy is the existence as the idea. The philosophical mind, which should have attained omniscience, would be nothing less than the mind of God. Excuse me. And it does not appear ridiculous to say that the purpose of the universe is the complete realization of the mind of God in actuality. Why not? The fact that Hegel, even for a Christian, should have regard... Okay, sorry. Here we have a description of the character of the absolute idea, but if Hegel succeeds, the character description and the formal logical description are identical. Hegel's phrase from the phenomenology of spirit, the actual is rational, talks about that. The end and purpose, telos, of the human spirit is the world process, a tautology. I would call it a tautology. In contrast, the purpose of life is to have experience, a common thread at the center of LDS doctrine. Here, however, Hegel offers a more robust description. It is a tautology because no sense is given. Obviously, to exist, to be human, is to have experience. Therefore, to say life is to have experience asserts nothing. It is senseless. I think it not in the last religious or Christian blasphemy to claim that the purpose of the universe or cosmos is the eventual complete realization of the mind of God in actuality, and that Hegel's philosophy reaches that no more than Orthodox Christianity scorns us, the Latter-day Saints, for blasphemy that we can become gods, join heirs with Christ. So, right, if a Latter-day Saint is going to be critical about Hegel's claims that his philosophy is the omniscience of God, just the form of God's omniscience, then that's just like saying, then we need to be critical that the claims that we can become God. You know, if we think that obedience to the laws and ordinances of the gospel, as so far as they've been already revealed to us, will transfigure or exalt us, as it has cities Salem, Melchizedek, the cities of Salem and Zion, Enoch's and Melchizedek's cities, then, and that happened in their mortality, then it can certainly happen in then it can certainly happen conceptually, because they've reached the next stage, like, of existence in actuality. Boom. All right. So the sphere of absolute spirit ends the Hegelian system. It appears as the final result of all development. Thus, the end of philosophy is also the beginning. This is what Hegel means when he says that philosophy is a circle which returns into itself. Here at the end of system of philosophy, we reach philosophy. If we ask what is the philosophy which we have reached, the only answer possible is to begin at the beginning of the logic, something, nothing, becoming. Thus, have reached the end, we must explain it, begin again at the beginning. This is the circle of philosophy. So, at the end of the Hegelian system is the beginning. The end is the beginning. The end is the end is the beginning. The logos is eternally valid and circular. Hence, if we ask what it is that philosophy we have reached, the only possible answer to begin at the beginning. Excuse me. Compare and contrast Joseph Smith holding up the Joseph Smith ring at the King Folly Discourse and saying, "I will take away the veil so that you may see. That which has a beginning has an end." That's good logic. Joseph Smith understood this idea. Because the circle logos is broken on this side, because we're on this side of the veil, we have questions and answers. Therefore, when we arrive at the end, we arrive at the beginning. Any question at the end has nowhere left to go, but back to the beginning again. This is what he did when he held up the ring. Just being on this side of the veil is being in a glass darkly. But it's not, it's not as if none of the other side is an object of consciousness. It is. It's just we don't see all of the elements of the other side, the visual fields, and that this world is real in the sense that it's empirically real. That, if we accept that everything, the only things that exist is an empirical fact. And consciousness, at least ostensibly, has an end in death when the body dies, because even though consciousness is a capacity, and capacities aren't objects, we don't have evidence that they exist anymore, because the brain that actuated the capacity is gone, and the body gets burned or goes back in the ground or whatever. So we see through a glass darkly, and in that sense we walk through faith. But it's not that we can't understand or ask questions of everything that's on the other side. There won't be that much of a difference, I don't think. It's just that we still have to walk by faith in that we're not in that world right now. But anyways, just to kind of, what Paul says that the glass darkly, Joseph Smith held up the ring like that, so I'm just illustrating. In the King Folly Discourse and talking about this idea. Therefore, when we arrive at the end, we arrive at the beginning, and question at the end has nowhere left to go, but back to the beginning again. Paul says, again, that which is in part shall be done away, contingent. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as I am known. That's what Paul is talking about. The veil, but it's dark. It's not that we don't have access to it. We certainly do. It's just dark. It's kind of a haze. It's difficult. Then shall I know even as also I am known. The dissolution of the subject-object distinction is absolute idea in and for itself, form and content. So Paul was a Hegelian. Hegel was anyways, he's a Christian. It's right there. Hegel may succeed at his project. However, it succeeded at a formal description of the dialectic of exaltation. He may not succeed in character becoming thought. He may succeed in a formal description of character becoming. All I am saying is that the absolute truth must be chosen, as Kierkegaard says. Christianity must be believed. No change of heart can occur from a distance, but form and content can become one. Even if we succeed in giving the description of losing ourselves or changing our hearts for God, we have not succeeded in converting the whole world by the reading of words or understanding alone. These things must still be believed in order to become them. and I think Hegel would agree to this, and Wittgenstein. And the conclusion I'm making so far through getting through these readings is, even if we succeed in describing, and we already have if we accept a religion as the absolute truth and its ethics, like the commandments or whatever, even if we already have a book that successfully describes this, and the movement of thought along this shift and change, we haven't just changed like that. Change of the heart doesn't happen in that way. It's a willful response. Bishop Barron defines faith as a willful response to the revelation of God, or something like that. That's how we change. We believe it, and we decide that this is how I'm going to live my life. And slowly, through time, we become that thing, and we receive a new character. And that doesn't happen just from reading the commandments or a book of scripture or a code of ethics or Hegel's system. You have to believe something to change, and that's a willful response. The Introduction to the Science of Logic by Hegel. Okay, I want this to be under 2 hours, so excuse me. So I gotta be quicker than I could probably be. Okay. Truth is the agreement of thought with the subject matter, and in order to produce this agreement, where it is not there on its own account, thought is expected to be subservient and responsive to the subject matter. That's right. Hegel is really, he's really incorporating the will, and I think he's really trying to, and I would need to study him a lot more to actually see if he succeeds at that, but like, he's aware of the contention I have, and maybe he satisfies it, because I haven't read everything from Hegel. Really what I've read, more or less, is just what I have in the syllabus and what we're going over. So maybe he does, but that's obviously true, right? So he says truth is the agreement of thought with the subject matter. So who has thought? Well, we have thought. So the will, Hegel doesn't want to say the will, though. Thought is expected to be, he just says thought, subservient and responsive to the subject matter. He doesn't say the will. Or spirit. He says thought. Because maybe he's right, but again, thought is just one aspect of the human being. And thought is bound up with all the other aspects of the human being. That's true, and so it could describe all the other experiences of the human being. But precisely because it's not, I think, the only capacity of the human being, Hegel's system isn't going to change us into what we want to become, or what we want to become. We'll have to believe it and act on it in order for that to happen. That's a willful response. Thinking isn't going to get us there alone, is my argument so far. Wow, so I put this as scripture. This is beautiful. This has to be true because the will is choice, and so the only formal description. Hegel is aware of this and calls it an agreement between thought and the subject matter. I interpreted it that way, but now I look, he's just using the word truth, but will, the things and the thinking of them agree in and for themselves. Also, our language expresses a kinship between them. That thinking in its immanent determinations and the true nature of things are not the same. Here Hegel explicates the logical consequences of Parmenides' insight that language and thought are one. He does that right by saying that language expresses a kinship between them. Between what? The things and the thinking of them. Between thought and the things. So not that it's language and thought are one, but that things, that like Wittgenstein, that the world and language are one. Because logic is the internal relation between world and language. Turned against reason, this understanding behaves in the manner of ordinary common sense. Giving credence to the latter's view that truth rests on a sensuous reality. I'm going to go over the bolds. When not carried through, this insight runs in the misconception that reason is the one that contradicts itself. It fails to see that contradiction is in fact the elevation of reason above the restrictions of the understanding and disillusions of them. I'm quoting Hegel here from the introduction of Logic. Being charitable to him, we can interpret this to just mean that precisely because there's a contradiction must mean that we can go beyond it. I don't know what to make of that claim, but it's at least a claim. I mean, it's at least something analytic from which we can proceed or not proceed that he's making. Okay. Definitions is always a matter of argumentation as to what is to be included or excluded from it, within which limits and to what extent, but argumentation is open to the most manifold and various opinions, and on these, a decision can finally be determined only arbitrarily. In this method of beginning science with a definition, no mention is made the need of so talking about how earlier causes, reason, or a cause, a definite article in English, is contingent, and so we need a higher explanation. Well, the same goes for definitions. If we're just starting in philosophy or in the beginning of a science with a definition, then we're not getting, we don't get a necessary self-explanatory principle or axiom in philosophy if we just get definitions. Something like reason has to be self-explanatory. And so that's an important distinction to me. He says, talking about spirit, and his first work is the phenomenology of spirit. Spirit itself, which contains both determinations within itself, something inwardly self-contradictory and self-dissolving. He's describing sublation there of things moving into their opposites and then moving to a higher category. But he says that's what spirit does. Spirit finds a way. And I wanted to compare and contrast this. So the phenomenology of spirit moves past self-contradiction. This has a religious element because after all the Holy Ghost is spirit, and the spirit is that which quickeneth the understanding, and all things are known by God's spirit in and through his spirit. Thus, if Hegel's philosophy is an attempt to describe the mind of God and is omniscient in this regard, compare and contrast Carl Jung, famous psychologist. The greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. This is a Hegelian insight shared by Jung. However, Jung has as his subject matter the will only, psychology, and not the absolute truth. Right? Psychologists probably don't like and I've heard this from a psychologist, they don't like the word truth, because then if it's not the will or human emotion that gets to choose the truth, and that truth is something independent of will and human emotion, then one, it either has to discover it and work towards it, or two, then it doesn't get to choose what is the truth in a certain sense. That's really important, as I've been interested in some philosophy of psychology. Qua philosophy of psychology. That's really important. Oh yeah, listen, Hegel says critical philosophy did indeed already turn metaphysics into logic. I wanted to compare and contrast my professor, Michael Artz. Wittgenstein shows that logic is even more important than metaphysics. Well, obviously, Hegel thinks that too, but Wittgenstein argued that too. And I think they're right, because they're describing the character of logic as like reason, or something that's absolute or self-sufficient, right? So, yeah, it's more fundamental than causes, because again, causes are contingent and not self-explanatory, but logic or reason is logos qua logos. Really good stuff. Again, I for the sake of time, I just want to say how bold Hegel is. Yet I know that it is the one and only true method. His system. He says that. That's his own words. Oh man, that's awesome. And I think this is why Nietzsche says, maybe it's from this sentence, Nietzsche says, Germany would be Hegelian even if there never was a Hegel. Meaning, like, Germans would make this kind of a claim that they have the absolute truth. I think that's really interesting. Like, there's no limits for the Germans, intellectually, that they've seen, so and they've made great progress as a society. Bach, Mozart, Einstein, Freud, their contribution to culture has been incalculable. Okay. Alright, so next, let's go to the introduction to the Encyclopedia of Logic. As I started to really hone what my interests and concerns in philosophy are, I came that it's to religious epistemology. How do we know the truth, the validity, and truth of religious claims, especially religious propositions that logically contradict one another? Hegel makes clear here what I may have already mentioned, but I learned it from here, from the introduction to the Encyclopedia of Logic, that any object, any experience, human experience, is an object of consciousness. And therefore, anything that's an object of consciousness is amenable to thought. It can be described. It may not, right? A thought isn't going to feel alone, right? When we abstract thought, as Hegel's system does. But what it will do, is he's right in saying that there's nothing that can't be said or at least described in language. Okay, you can't feel something by reading something like alone. You can't have someone else's feelings and but that person will describe their feelings and you'll be able to understand them. And you can even have empathy. The empathy is theirs, but the pain, let's say if they're writing about pain or using pain verbs, pain words, is still theirs. But the language describes this and can even engender a feeling. So again, that just shows that it's not completely separate. So as much as we want to maybe say that, we have that temptation, it's clear that it's not. And that's important for religious epistemology, which may say you can only feel the truth or something like that. And that could be the case, but we could still describe the feeling, which would be important. And if we would say God was revealing a truth, then we could describe the truth, even if it was merely felt. Because people say all the time in religious experience, I have the feeling that I shouldn't go down that alley, or I have the feeling that I should stay, and then they'll talk about what good or protection came from it later. The feeling was still a proposition. All right. So, militating against the layman's philosophy. Ooh, terrible misspelling. So, yeah. I hear people who aren't philosophers, right? They're so pessimistic or just chagrin or they're just so there's another word, passive about philosophy. So Hegel tackles this, which I love. We often hear about people just thinking they can say, well, that's my philosophy, as if philosophy is a mere choice or belief. While it is true that for a religion or philosophy to take hold of the creature to have an impact or an effect, these are my notes, they must choose it in a sense of belief, a willful response, but philosophy must be demonstrative, systematic, analytic, etc. There must be some kind of process. So Hegel says now, unsystematic philosophizing can only be expected to give expression to personal peculiarities of mind, and has no principle for the regulation of its contents. Apart from their interdependence and organic union, the truths of philosophy are valueless, and must then be treated as baseless hypotheses or personal convictions. Yet many philosophical treatises confine themselves to such an exposition, unfortunately, of the opinions and sentiments of the author. The term system is often misunderstood. It does not denote a philosophy, the principle of which is narrow and distinguished from others. On the contrary, genuine philosophy makes it a principle to include every particular principle. Again, so the layman's philosophy, oh, that's my philosophy, and he thinks that that's a legitimate philosophy. It's not. It has to be a process. You have to have it embedded in some kind of process, in some kind of system. Otherwise, no philosopher is going to take you seriously, and nobody, other layman or anyone else in general, should take you seriously. Each of the parts of philosophy is a philosophical whole, a circle rounded and complete in itself. In each of these parts, however, the philosophical idea is found in a particular specificality or medium. The single circle, because it is a real totality, bursts through the limits imposed by its special medium and gives rise to a wider circle. The whole of philosophy in this way resembles a circle of circles. The idea appears in each single circle, but at the same time the whole idea is constituted by the system of these peculiar phases, and each is a necessary member of the organization. This is, in short, the one single aim, action, and goal of philosophy, to arrive at the notion of its notion and thus secure its return on satisfaction. In other words, philosophy must be sufficient and self-explanatory. Here is a great description as to why philosophy must be systematic, as the whole science and only the whole can exhibit what the idea or the reason is impossible to give a preliminary way of general impression of a philosophy, nor can a division of philosophy into its parts be intelligible except in a connection with the system. Great argument. I mean, philosophy has to be systematic. There you go. Boom. Philosophy is systematic. Yeah. This is where that famous line is that you can't learn how to swim except by getting in the water. But to seek to know before we know is as absurd as the wise resolution of Scholasticus not to venture into the water until he had learned to swim. There it is. In its own field, this empirical knowledge may at first satisfaction, but in two ways it can come short. Scientific knowledge of the physical world may at first satisfy thought, but shortly after does not. Just saying empirical science won't be enough for spirit, for thought. It will crave more, and it will see how limited scientific propositions are, empirical propositions. This is important. We must be in contact with any fact in order to believe it. So that is to say, there can't be an ineffable truth that we aren't in contact with, or a truth that we just can't know. We have to be in contact with it somehow in order to believe it. So I say there is no mystical in this sense. We know at least to some degree what we are in contact with precisely because we are in contact with it. Hegel goes on to define faith as a kind of intuition. The gift from God is immediate knowledge and defines it as revelation in the outward world and in our heart. I would be interested to know why he calls it outward world, because Wittgenstein's phrase is, I understand it as not being possible that there's an outside. To see that thought in its very nature is dialectical and that as understanding it must fall into contradiction, the negative of itself will form one of the main lessons of logic. When thought grows hopeless of ever achieving by its own means the solution of contradiction, which is by its own action brought upon itself, it turns back to those solutions of the question with which the mind has learned to pacify itself in some of its other modes and forms. However, the retreat of thought has led, as Plato noticed even in his time, to a very uncalled hatred of reason. I guess what's called misology. And then it takes up against its own endeavors that hostile attitude of which an example is seen in the doctrine that immediate knowledge, as it is called, is the exclusive form in which we become cognizant of truth. So he's saying, by our old conceptions of logic and reason, when we get to a limiting case, we see that as the end and then we turn against reason. Instead of using reason and going beyond the contradiction or perceived problem, which we should do, it then just turns to faith. And we hear this in the Orthodox Christianity where, like, we just can't understand the ways of the Lord. Like, strange and nonsensical, nevertheless somehow instructable are the ways of the Lord. And I'm trying to bring that out because Truman Madsen talks about that. So again, Hegel says that the law of non-contradiction is a kind of cop-out that leads to a sure reason and turn hatred for reason that becomes even more hostile and ends in the dogmatic claim of religious knowledge that we just can't understand the truth. Compare and contrast Madsen's argument against Orthodox Christianity that claims that to take reason captive, but this retreat to mystery even for its advocate leaves gnawing anxieties, for nothing is more barren to one in agony than pat answers which seem the unfeeling evasions of a distant spectator who never felt a wound. Again, it's not really acceptable to just take reason captive in the mystical. So law of non-contradiction, like I said, that's a kind of cop-out for Hegel that leads to a true reason. Talking about, just in summary again, Madsen calls it gnawing anxieties, to take reason captive as a religious perspective. Okay. Be ready. So I want to say Hegel is saying even after the oracles of science, silent revelation, these revelations must still give way to reflective thought, which constitutes a part of philosophy and is why philosophy is above religion in his system. Compare and contrast. Be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of his hope that is in you with weakness and fear. 1 Peter 3:15. So even after we receive, or let's say we receive something that we can't describe, we're not justified to say that, because what we can't describe is still amenable to reflective thought. That would either just be because, one, someone is intellectually lazy, or they lack the hermeneutical depth to describe that experience, but they could nevertheless try. Anybody who has a basic understanding of language, as Wittgenstein says, it should be sufficient. And Paul's also just, concerning Christianity, Peter says that you should be able to give a reason for that which you can't describe. Okay. So we're going to move on. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through these, so in the time I wanted to allot, 2 hours, so I'm going to read like one thing from each slide now, but I'll show them nevertheless, because this has been a lot of work. It would take like a semester or something, or a term, to go through them well. Just brief from preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit. We really just get, I'll say, a summary of Hegel's system in his preface. And I love how he just opens, he's doing philosophy in his preface. And I think that is really just shows how serious of a philosopher and analytic, at least, that Hegel is. Because if philosophy is systematic and analytic, then he has such integrity to that's even explicit in the preface of his book. And he also says he says any legitimate system of philosophy must be sufficient and self-explanatory, right? It can't be arbitrary in the least. And he says that like a preface that's written in the way in which it stands to another philosophical work, therefore, is inappropriate. Which is awesome. It's hilarious that he says that. Okay. All right, this was a great, clearer summary than the Method of the Tractatus by Conant about different readings of the Tractatus. This is by Barry Stoker from Post-Analytic Tractatus. And it's 20 pages. It's called Making Sense of Nonsense, I think. Yeah. Could have spent a lot more time on this. How can I try and summarize this in a minute? The end of this essay, he says, I might say, he quotes Wittgenstein, if the place I want to get to could only be reached by a ladder, I would give up trying to get there. For the place I really have to get to is a place I must already be at now. Anything that I might reach by climbing a ladder does not interest me. That is the best argument, maybe historical, exegetical argument for Conant's reading of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. That Wittgenstein has not, he's trying to give a theory, but he has not, and has wise enough and committed enough to that metaphilosophical principle that philosophy leaves everything where it is, and philosophy is just trying to get elucidation. It's an activity in elucidation, and the Tractatus and all of Wittgenstein's works are to that aim, elucidation. And in so they attempt to do a theory, but Wittgenstein has always maintained that there can be no philosophical theories. But if we try and get really good theories that teach us a lot, then we can make progress, but progress in elucidation. So that's what his essay ended with. I'll just say it is clearer now to me. So it seems from when this article was published, the challenges to the Conant and Diamond interpretation of the Tractatus are merely exegetical. That means that the other works of Wittgenstein in which he repudiates certain aspects of the Tractatus, but then it's not really a problem. They haven't argued that much for it, and maybe it's because it's not important. One, because, well, if we are just good philosophers and we follow the argument where it leads, then we can just use Conant's interpretation if we're not just being historians, and that's then true just philosophically. Or if we want to just be good Wittgensteinian scholar historians and just try and understand what Wittgenstein meant and not try and learn any philosophy or follow the argument where it leads, we can still look at other passages in Wittgenstein's work in the early and later and in between Wittgenstein, middle Wittgenstein, where he has maintained and said things like, I still think the same thing of the Tractatus, but for different reasons. His theory failed, but again, he knew that he could never give a theory, but the theory is just elucidation, but that's not really a theory. That's the only ways in which Conant's interpretation does a better idea than Hacker or the orthodox interpretations of making sense of the Tractatus as a whole in the preface and in the end, and in 654 and 7, Proposition 7 of the Tractatus, that contradict each other. The orthodox reader can't really coherently make those propositions compatible. And Conant's interpretation does. And it also calls for an interpretation that transcends the analytic continental divide, which is awesome and is what I have held. In that we need to the book is to understand Wittgenstein, and in which continental philosophy is saying there's just something unknowable, phenomenological. That's not an option either. And I think that I'll continue for a long time, to study Wittgenstein, and I'm totally open to whatever seems most plausible. I haven't read all of Wittgenstein, so there's still so much for me to probably grapple with. But based on reading the Tractatus a couple times and understanding a lot of its ideas pretty well, I would say that this is awesome. And in being as intelligent and shrewd as I know Wittgenstein to be, he would be aware of this and the contradictory nature of the Tractatus, right? And so the only way that the Orthodox readers try to rescue the Tractatus is by using the phrase illuminating nonsense. But we in Wittgenstein know from a logical standpoint the only kind of nonsense is utter nonsense. So according to Conant, right, what he wanted us to do is to see that the Tractatus implodes from the inside. And that is to see that while there are senseless propositions that are tautologies or contradictions, the propositions of logic are tautologies. So they're shown in a logical notation. Nevertheless, they are grasped by thought. And even according to the Tractatus, if they're grasped by thought, then they're candidates for language. They're just candidates for description. And so they cannot, then the logical syntactical reading, orthodox reading, that like the logical positives that want to relegate or put limits on meaningful discourse is not possible when you take, when you say that you know the limits. And we already know from Hegel to say that you know a limit is actually already to get past it. And then therefore to have knowledge of what it is you were saying you had a limit to, which is related to the unknowable. Wittgenstein had to have been, was aware of that too, I would argue. So it became clear about really what interpretations there are of it, and I'm really grateful. I think this is a must-read for anybody who's seriously investigating Wittgenstein. I would read it either before, but probably after the Tractatus, is what I would recommend. The Introduction from the Dissertation Sense, Nonsense, and Senselessness, an essay in the continuity of the thought of Ludwig Wittgenstein. This was by Dunlap from Marquette University. He wrote his dissertation and it was on typewriting. March 1972, I think it was published. And I just came across this and I thought I could learn from this. He gives a good description of logical notation. The existential quantifier stand as a sign for all possible propositions. So such combinations of signs leave open the possibility that any fact of the world may be included. Since any fact of the world may be included under such a combination of signs, no fact of the world can falsify such a combination of all possible facts. Dunlap brings a lot of clarity to Tractatus and the picture theory of meaning. The relation of a proposition to the world is exactly parallel to the relation of a picture to the world. That's really helpful. The only way to discover what the sign means is to attend to the sign in its application. Thus again, it is a significant use of the subject's self-willing the sign as the application of the sign that constitutes its symbol. Getting clear about that. I thought this was helpful. Thus, the different senses, his thoughts of proposition demand different methods of verification of their truth or falsity. Sense propositions are bipolar. They have truth or false dimensions. They can be verified. Dunlap does hold on to orthodox reading of the Tractatus, but is nevertheless reaching out for something that goes beyond it. I like the idea here that different sense of propositions demands different methods of verification. That is obviously true and an important linguistic emphasis to make. In addition to that, Dunlap has concerns that what he calls the metaphysical I or the subjective self as the will. That's something I'm interested in. I think it's very important to note, because he's even apprehending this. This has something to do with the so-called continental analytical divide. That this was the kind of reading Conant makes of the Tractatus that is a call for a transcendence of it. Yeah, okay. So I would read him further if I want to pursue that. Then he makes a distinction between phenomenological propositions and empirical propositions, and talks about how the private language argument and logic plays a role. We can't verify what the person's sense experience actually is, but we can verify the sense of their propositions and its logical grammar once determined in language. This is important to realize for Conant's reading. So let's say someone says, because you can say, I see a green color patch, that can be put into formal logic between there is a green color patch. Then we get rid of the I, which brings in ambiguity and controversy right altogether. And these sentences then are logically consistent. If they're logically consistent, then we didn't need the I in the first place. And then he says that this proves, like Wittgenstein dampens phenomenological privacy, or the so-called logical privacy in phenomenological description. I think I have that here. Yeah, because the I can be removed in phenomenological language. Example, I see a red color patch can be converted into there is a red color patch. Dissipates the problem of private solipsistic access. Awesome. This is something I'm very interested in. Okay, again, Wittgenstein is doing that. So there's no such thing as a logically private language. But now that I think about it, Wittgenstein isn't really doing due justice to what the phenomenologist's concern is with this. The phenomenologist is actually more indeterminate. He's thinking something like the private self and the experiences can never be put in language. Wittgenstein, we would do better in showing that it can be, and then once they accept that, then showing that there can't be a logically private language. First, we need to get the phenomenologist to see that this whole phenomenon thing is not separate from language, and so we can analyze it. I think we would need to start there, but this has been really helpful in making a step towards that. I gotta move on. Let's move on. Yeah, that was in there too. Proposition, sense, and senselessness. That's 8A. On Dumb Laugh, that was in there too. Went over that. Hacker. He wrote a book called Wittgenstein. He's a very clear writer, and he's an orthodox reader of the Tractatus and Wittgenstein, so he is in the business of using logical syntactical analysis to put limits on thought, and he employs logical grammar, and you can do all of that. It's just that I would differ from Hacker in that his reading of the Tractatus, in that really thinking that to have logical grammar and logico-syntactical analysis is not to put a limit, any kind of a limit. It's not. And I haven't gone into that over all my notes, but it is in my notes as to why that is. So he's just giving really a classical orthodox account of Wittgenstein's contribution to philosophy and why it's needed throughout this book. And it makes different divisions through the philosophy of mind, epistemology, etc. And so I really liked how he quotes Wittgenstein too. What we are destroying is nothing but a house of cards. So he's right in that if, we can use grammar, logical grammar, but only once we have a proposition, which is a subject-predicate form, and then once we agree on how our signs signify or symbolize, we have our discrete meanings in place, then do we have the grammar of the object, the name of the object in language. A really good summary. Anybody should read it, this little book, who's interested in Wittgenstein. Now the rest of this book is on Max Black's Introduction to the Tractatus, which I think was published in '62. He was like one of the first serious interpreters of the Tractatus, scholarly anyways. Let's see. I've got all this divided. He makes a lot of things clear, but as a student of Conant's, and as I agree with Conant, I don't accept the orthodox translation, orthodox interpretations of the Tractatus. But it's always interesting to me that they were always aware of this. I think they had to be aware of its instability, but they nevertheless wanted to, out of their love, to finally put a limit on philosophy, to embrace that claim at the end of the Tractatus, right, and use the Tractatus as a tool in doing so. But they're always aware of that problem, and they kind of address it here and there, but not discreetly or holistically, otherwise they know they'd be forced to come up with something else. So if the proposition considered is not elementary, it would determine a region in logical space rather than a place, or in other words, a point, a coordinate. The positive and the corresponding negative proposition might then be thought of as the negation tilde, drawing a boundary around the same region of logical space, if we think of logical space as a map. For the notions of logical space and logical place, anyways, yeah, see installment 23. But he really helped to just clear up, I've used the visual metaphor of logical space, which is fundamental to understanding the Tractatus, but it was nice to have the technical aspects of the Tractatus be given its language in its place, its location within the visual metaphor of logical space, which he did. So that was really nice. So there's coordinates and regions within logical space. So it's like a sense can give, if we apprehend or grasp, let's say, some propositional content, but we're not yet fully determinate, we have a region in logical space. We might have like a country. We don't know the city. Maybe the city or the latitude, longitude, the exact coordinates of a region in logical space is something like identifying the symbol with total indeterminacy. So it's nice to just expand that visual metaphor a little bit with the technical aspects of the Tractatus, namely their negation and positive affirmation propositions. According to Coleman, it is not impossible to represent logical form if by represent black means communicating in some way. Again, I'm just showing that it's inherently unstable. So black has an orthodox reading. It says what is shown is not something we express. And I say, in being charitable to everything, that may be true if it means that what is absolutely true is independent of our expressing it without its existence in some form. But Black even admits that what shows itself is not wholly incommunicable. What shows itself is something about the form of the meaning, of then which we can say something about. So even he is aware of, he's in turn contradicting himself, but is aware of, but wants to hold on to the genius of the right Tractatus. Oh yeah, just thinking about the Schoenstein analogy, clearly, I like this. He says, in ordinary language we sometimes find showing opposed to describing or talking about. So don't describe the president to me. Show him, point him out. Put me in a position to see him for myself. Similarly, when I show somebody the crawl by swimming it, logical form is discovered by calculation with signs, not by intuition. That has to be true because once the signs are agreed upon, then the use of these combinations of signs reveals their logical form or grammar. Boom, I've got a really clear description of what grammar is then. And in what sense Wittgenstein could say that it was shown and what couldn't be said, in getting a Conan interpretation of that, because it's obviously still a candidate amenable to thought. So it's just that Wittgenstein gave that roux because his ultimate goal was to get the reader to see you can have the greatest, you can be as clever and as great as you can at trying to say something that can't be said, but the moment you're doing something like that, you leave something to indeterminacy, and that's nonsense. What is nonsense? Nonsense is just indeterminacy. It's not determining some of the elements of your proposition, like leaving them in the air. That's darkness, leaving them in the dark. That's what nonsense is. That's better than not one thing. Yeah, good, helpful visual metaphor. I'm going to run through this. Tautology and contradiction say nothing. Tautology and contradiction is limiting cases of truth functions. I wanted to get clear about sense, senselessness, and nonsense. Unzig, sinnlos, Sinn. In German, I wanted to get clear, have both a historical, linguistic argument. As I've looked now, I have a PDF document that puts the Guinness and the other two English translations of the Tractatus in the German. And I've looked at them now in these important propositions. And that's become really important. I wanted to understand this, and I've wanted arguments on both sides to try and understand from both an exegetical and just logical, philosophical standpoint the claims of the Tractatus and just to follow the argument where it leads, both from trying to understand Wittgenstein and from just logic, its philosophy itself, truth itself. And Wittgenstein says unzig, whereof anybody who understands me sees my propositions as unzig. That's not senseless, but that's nonsense. Can't be nonsense from a logical standpoint of view, because it's indeterminate. Logical truths are tautologies. So Wittgenstein, therefore, fights nonsense with nonsense. And that's what he did in the Tractatus. But he wants his readers then to understand him, not the propositions. Black says Wittgenstein, and that's why, again, it's a bridge between phenomenology or continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, because then there's no longer a distinction between the private self and propositions, logic. Black says Wittgenstein was militating against Russell's claim that logic deals in generalities. Black cites the argument that Wittgenstein considered tautology as a proposition of logic to not be a generality because they lack name, and therefore not a generalization because they say nothing. Logic and essential validity, the axiom of reducibility. The mystical. Uncomfortably and consciously aware of his own unstable reading of the Tractatus as an orthodox reading, Black called Wittgenstein's mysticism vacillating, and hops between passages in the Tractatus that seem to contradict each other on his interpretation. Admitting this equivocal character of what he only seems to reduce to Wittgenstein's mysticism in the Tractatus rather than most of the book, as the reason why the positivists could ignore it and try and use it to remove all meaningless discourse. Black does say this reading is all wrong and that the mysticism is a powerful motive for the book, but then fails to say why or how that is. And this is where his book ends. He doesn't say anything about it because, again, he knows for the reasons I've given what problems would arise if he did that. But I don't think that they are to blame, any of the Orthodox interpreters, because they just, according to Conan, Wittgenstein's book has been so successful in the extent to which it has failed, in that it has failed, its readers have failed to understand Wittgenstein, to understand that the propositions are indeterminate, that he hasn't actually meant anything by saying that which whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Because then Wittgenstein's apprehending something that you can speak about that's silent, and that's a candidate for thought, and therefore a candidate for language. And so Black and these Orthodox readers then have just seen, they have taken the ruse for an illusion for reality. They've taken Wittgenstein's idea that of indeterminacy, that the said-shown distinction of what would probably be one Spatian Conductivus von Schweigen, they've taken that seriously. That Wittgenstein meant something, but that's indeterminate. It's in the darkness. And what's left in the darkness doesn't come to the light. The idea, and I came to a conclusion, and I wrote about this somewhere in my notes, I think in this section. Here's what I actually am glad I learned from all of this, is I wrote about this. Let me see if I can find it. It might have been another one, but I thought I wrote about it. And again, yeah, this is the final document. It covers everything because it's just black. The reason, I think, another reason, and it could be indeterminate, but that philosophers are so hesitant to accept Conant's interpretation of the Tractatus is because they want to leave some things in indeterminacy, because indeterminacy can be a kind of place So it's like something that looks like it's a meaningful proposition. Nonsense. At least some elements of the propositions, like whereof one cannot speak, thereof must remain silent. That Wittgenstein was trying to say something that could not be said. Obviously, it's a canon that can be grasped, and if language and thought are one, which is at least describable of an experience, then you can say something about it. Then language can't fail in a sense. Then it could be because the Orthodox reader eschews Conant's interpretation because they want it to be indeterminate, because it's like the end of philosophy in a way. And it also, leaving it indeterminate, like the religionist that Hegel says, is to take reason captive. And when we take reason captive, we then turn against it hostilely in a way, or at least leave it indeterminate, or say that someone like Wittgenstein makes the said-shown distinction, and then we think we're being clever, and we just take it as is, because then it's like the end of philosophy. We don't have to do any work, and we can hold whatever we want to believe under that, and as if it's not amenable to reflective thought. So then we could accept that like a religious proposition just is shown and cannot be said. But thought can't get at this. So in that it can be described, but the will is a response to the human spirit. So it can be, I've just described it, right? But it hasn't like converted you, right? And you haven't changed to the religious propositions. But I think that's a reason why. And I've tried to understand maybe the psychology behind why people choose this. Not even on the psychology, what leads them to have those interpretations. Of course, I know literarily, according to the literature, why they could be led to that. That's all in there. But if they really look to the big things, it's also in there that that's not right, but that they choose to ignore or cleverly tries to convey away with illuminating nonsense to get around it, but still is not really faithful to the work. And so I've tried to understand that, and that's and this has had that impact on, if we go back to what I was trying to do on faith, like what is faith? So I'll try and answer this question now, and now I'll say that this is what faith is. It could be right in a sense. Kierkegaard says, faith is precisely where thought leaves off. Is everything outside of thought? There is a sense in which that has to be true. That doesn't mean, though, that I can't describe it. I can describe it, and I've already done that. But thought isn't going to do the work for you. You have to do the work for you, which is to believe and change your heart. So to give you an example, Kierkegaard talks about Abraham. He had to kill his son. Even before that, before the law of Moses, the Lord already condemned idolic sacrifice, which was what then God commanded to Abraham, and to sacrifice his only begotten son. But he had already blessed him that through Isaac, his posterity would become in multitude and number as the stars in the sky. So there's a contradiction. And look, Abraham has thought. He has the thought. What's the thought? The thought is God's commandment, kill your son, get up and kill your son. But as thought, I've learned this. Thought has to have two, which means thought has to have opposition. Thought has to have the good and the bad, or whatever. Thought has to have two subjects in order to think thought, to move through thought. And so Abraham could be thinking, I've been commanded not to kill my son. But God told me that that was wrong before. Now he's commanding me to kill him because he's trying to rely on himself, right? His own thought, right? Or, again, idolatry by human sacrifice is unjust. Or he'll go through all of these thoughts and oppositional thoughts, and thought will have nowhere else to go except the commandment of God. Thought comes to an end in that it can no longer think itself out of the situation. It's no longer in control with premises and conclusions or a dialectic. It has to make a willful response to God's will, in that it was a revelation, right, through the Holy Ghost, whether it was auditory or not, from God to Abraham, get up and kill your son. If he really knew that that was from God, and he believed and trusted that it was from God, thought had nowhere else to go but to act or not act on God's commandment. And in that way, faith is precisely where thought leaves off. But I've described this, right? So language isn't wholly separate from, but it can't do all the work. Thought can't do all the work. You need a willful response to God. As G.E. Moore said, he jumped up on a table that impressed Wittgenstein. He said something like, God doesn't want a head any old cabbage would do. What God wants is a heart. Wittgenstein said, I like that. That's the religious language game in action. Heart, the will, it's the poetic center of the human being, religious propositions, and the religious language, ethical language game in the later Wittgenstein. All right. Something and nothing I don't think I got too clear about. I've kind of moved past these problems a little bit, but they were still really related. I would say nothing doesn't exist from, even Heidegger says this, and I agree with him, nothing doesn't exist from a linguistic standpoint. So then, like, we really can't talk about what it is we experience in a sense. But Heidegger still uses the word, but whenever the positivists, Carnap, criticize him, he's like, you're right. Even though Conant would say, well, no, because, anyways, for reasons in the method of the Tractatus. But still, there's that of what I'm trying to say, too. But I would just say it's not left out of grasp of description in language or a logical notation. That's what I'm going to say. So I've met the potential assignments, which is to get at least one page of notes. I ended up doing a lot more than that. I did way too much. I should have done something more concise. Yeah, I got through these readings, and it's been really great. Really great. So I'm grateful that BYU has a reading elective that's part of the philosophy undergraduate curriculum, so that you can choose your own readings that you're interested in, develop a system. So I titled this Hegel and Wittgenstein, the Analytic Perspective and its Impact on Faith. And it has helped get clearer about that. So there we are. And that's it for me.